Hi there everyone, welcome back to Dandelion Delphi tutorials. Today we're going to look at conditional loops. So that is our while and our repeat loops. You need to make a decision as to when to use a conditional loop. A conditional loop will stop when a certain condition is met or will continue to execute while a condition is met. With our for loops, we knew exactly how many times something must execute. So we got input from the user to say loop from 1 to the number that the user entered, or maybe from 1 to the length of a string that the user entered. But with conditional loops, we are unsure how many times the code must execute, or should it execute at all. It is important to remember that you may not use an exit inside of any loop. So if you want to make a loop stop, and you're using a for loop, that's not going to be possible because a for loop will execute from the lower boundary to the upper boundary in the for loop heading. And it's for that reason why we need conditional loops. Something else to remember about all three of our loops, our non-conditional loop, for loop, as well as our conditional loops, repeat and while, is that when you need input from the user, you have to use an input box, as the user will not have time to change a value on an edit box on the form while the loop is executing. To choose between a repeat and a while loop, you need to ask yourself, how many times is the minimum that the code inside of these loops need to execute? We use a repeat loop when the code on the inside of the loop needs to execute at least once. Here's an example of testing for a valid answer of a multiple choice question. A repeat loop will execute at least once because the condition sits at the bottom. Very important is that what variable you are testing here in the condition needs to be changing inside of your repeat loop, else you will fall into an infinite loop. You will also see that a repeat does not have a begin and an end, and you can have more than one line of code on the inside of a repeat. We have repeat until and then the condition here, which follows the same rules as we have done in if statements. Anything you used in an if statement condition, you can also use in here. Just a quick revision on our in operator. The variable that we are testing here using an in has to either be an integer or a char. And I don't want my program to be case sensitive, so therefore I've used uppercase. You can't use uppercase because the result of uppercase is a string and then will no longer be compatible with the in operator. So here I'm testing if the answer that the person entered is a value from A to D. That means it's a valid answer for the multiple choice questions. It's not necessarily correct though. Let's say the person enters in an A. That means that for the first time my loop executes, my condition here will be true. So repeat until A is in this range A to D. That is true, so my repeat loop won't execute again. Let's say the person entered an X the first time this loop executed. Our condition here at the bottom will be false. Therefore, it will execute again and ask the person for new input until their answer is a value from A to D. So our repeat loop will repeat until a certain condition is true, and it will execute at least once. Something else to take note of is just a reminder that if we want to store a value as a char data type, making use of an input box, we need to add the square brackets 1 there to convert it, or to copy out really just the first character to be able to store it as a char data type, as an input box returns a string data type. To decide when to use a while loop, this is when we are unsure whether the loop must execute at all. Let's take this example where the user is entering a password. If this password does not have a length of 8, we need to add stars to it and also count the number of stars that we are adding. But if the person entered a password that already has 8 or more characters, the stars should not be added at all. Therefore, we are unsure whether this loop must execute at all, and that is when we use a while loop, because the while loop condition sits at the top, and our while loop reads, while this is true, continue to do the following. So while the length of the password is less than 8, continue to add stars. When our while loop has more than one line of code inside it to be executed, we need to have a begin and an end. More often than not, our while loops will need a begin and an end because we usually do more than one thing on the inside of the while loop. So here I'm adding the star, and I also want to count the number of stars added. Let's say the person entered a password with a length of 4. The last time that this loop will execute would be when the 4th star is added. At this point, the password length is 8, and when my while loop tests the condition here at the top again, the length of the password is now 8, and 8 is not smaller than 8, and therefore it will then not execute the code between this begin and end again. Now that you know conditional loops, you will often experience your program hanging. When you run your program and you can't click and drag your form around after clicking on some button, it means you're in an infinite loop. And that just means that the loop keeps looping and it never stops. To avoid that, remember with while loops, ITC, and this is all on the same variable. We need to initialize, test, and change on the inside of the while loop the same variable. Often when we don't initialize the variable, the loop does not execute at all. We also need to determine the length of something here, so this variable needs a value before we test it above this line of code. And then we fall into an infinite loop if we don't change this variable, because then this condition here stays the same throughout the program. So it's very important to change the variable that you are testing in your while loop inside of your while loop. If you haven't done so already, make sure that you go to this link here to download the data files of my book. I want you to continue in the program in the conditional loops folder and go to the menu repeat, and then follow the unique number menu and code the following. Press pause and try it yourself before you watch the rest of the video that contains the memo. Remember, this is now part of the more difficult part of grade 12 examinations. In grade 10, we are preparing you really for question 1, and this would be the more difficult part of question 1. So it is a bit of a challenge. Don't give up, don't press play until you have tried it yourself. You are also getting to the part of IT where there's no single answer. There could be multiple ways of solving this question. Important is that you look at your output and that no numbers were repeated. I've used a counter here to make my loop stop, and I am using snum, initializing it because we're using it on both sides of the assignment statement. There's a loop, so I'm going to initialize it just above the loop. You can see it is a local variable. Every time my loop executes, I am going to pick a random number from 0 to 9. I'm converting that to a string so that I can use sRandom now in my pos. And what I'm testing here is if this random number that was picked with this execution of the loop, does it already exist in snum? If pos returns a 0, it means this random number is not inside of snum yet. Then I can start with my begin and an end, and I'm incrementing iCount, and I'm adding this random number to snum, the number that I must generate. And my until here will execute until iCount is equal to 10. So as you can see, I am changing and testing the same variable. Another way to do this is to use the length of snum. So you could repeat until the length of snum is equal to 10. It will follow the same rule as I am testing snum and I am changing snum on the inside of my loop. And then finally we're just displaying this number that we generated. Now go to the while loop menu and then to the sub-menu culottes. Read this question and press pause. I will show you an example of output just now. Here are some examples of output when 20 was entered for this one, 35 for this one, and 19 for the last one. Try these examples of input and output. Don't continue to watch unless you have tried yourself. So here I have input from the user for a number. I'm just clearing the rich edit there. And I am initializing scolats, my string variable, with the number entered, as that would be the first one in my SQL. I'm going to continue to loop while inum is not equal to 1, because it says that we need to stop the loop once we reach 1. The question then said to us that if this number is odd, I need to multiply the number by 3 and add 1, and that would be my next term. If the number was even, I needed to take the number and divide it by 2. I used round here, but since it's an even number, it will always have an integer answer. The only reason I needed to do that is to continue to use inum to ensure that I'm able to store it as an integer and not as a real value. If the number is not equal to 1, I'm going to add the term with a space to my string variable scolats. Make sure your while loop has a begin and an end, and we have initialized, tested, and changed inum on the inside of the while loop. And then finally outside of my while loop, I am just displaying my variable scolats. For more activities on repeat and while loops and more explanations and rules, go to Dandelion Delphi Book 1. Remember, practice makes perfect, and just watching the videos are not good enough. You need to practice on your own. Hope to see you soon.